Hey everybody, MS Farzan here, and welcome back to this video series on how to make a 2D multiplayer tabletop card game using Unity and Mirror. In our previous episode, we basically built out the functionality for us to have a host and a client, a server plus client, be able to draw cards, and then another client to connect to that server, draw cards as well, and then when I draw cards on client A, you're able to see them on your screen and vice versa. But we can see each other's cards, and when I drag and drop a card in my drop zone, you don't see that happen on your client and vice versa. So let's deal with the drag and drop issue first. That's actually the easiest one to figure out given the architecture we've already built. What it's going to require is for us to go into our drag and drop script, which is someplace. Here it is. So right now I'm in my player manager script, and I'm going to jump over to my drag and drop script, which we wrote, feels like I don't know, like an era ago. And at the top of it, we're going to make this into a network compatible script. So we're going to say using Mirror at the top. And we're going to make sure that it derives from network behavior instead of mono behavior. And I mentioned, I think in the previous video, that this public game object drop zone declaration is actually not necessary anymore. It's obsolete based on a previous version of the game that I had made. So you can go ahead and delete that, and also delete the reference to it here in the start method. And then yet at the top of the script, we do need a public player manager called player manager, which we're going to reference similarly to what we did in the draw card script. And we do have a few declarations here that will still work for us. The drop zone, whether it's is over drop zone, the start position. Something else that we need to do here is we need to add a private Boolean is draggable. I'm going to set that to false to begin with. The reason why we use this is draggable Boolean is we're going to check whether or not the client that we're working on, if it has authority over the game object to be able to manipulate its transform. For example, if you draw a card and I don't check for whether or not I have authority over that card, I might be able to move it around on my client, and that might be fine. Like there may not be issues with that in your game. But in the game we're creating right here, I want to say whosoever draws the card has authority over it and is able to drag it around the screen. If they didn't draw the card, they don't have authority over it, and they're not able to drag it across the screen. So when this game object is created in the scene, in the start method, after we find the canvas, we're going to just do a check, and we'll say if it doesn't have authority, make sure that is draggable, not is dirty, is draggable is equal to false. So actually, I read that wrong in my notes. We want to start out with it true. You could do this either way. It doesn't really matter all that much, but we're saying that we're going to start with is draggable being true, means that all cards can be dragged when they're instantiated. But after it's instantiated, check to see if it has authority. If it doesn't have authority, make it false. Like I said, you could do it the opposite way, but we're just deal with it this way. Okay. And now we don't need to do anything here in our collision enter 2D or collision exit 2D. Those can stay the same. The one thing that we need to do is that during the start drag method, which you'll recall is called by the event trigger when someone starts dragging the card, we want to say if is draggable, or is not draggable, we should say, if is draggable is not true, just return. Don't execute the rest of this code block. And that's just a shorthand way of saying that, like, if the game object is not draggable, don't do anything. Don't do anything after this. And then everything else here is just going to be fine for us. We still want to save the start parent and the start position, and we want to set is dragging to true. And then in the update method, we see that we're just making sure that we set the parent to the canvas if it's dragging, and then make sure that the transform position follows the mouse. We don't need to change anything here. What we do need to change a little bit here is the nDrag method. Here we also want to say if is draggable, if it's not draggable, return, just to make sure that we edge out any edge cases with the card being dragged. And we want is dragging to be set to false. Now, if the game object is over the drop zone, and the player has stopped dragging, so the nDrag method has been called by the nDrag trigger attached to the game object. What we've done here before in our single player game is set the parent of the transform to the drop zone, the transform of the drop zone, and we still want to do this, but we want to change a few things here. First of all, we want to set is draggable to false. At least in our game. In our game, we're saying once you've dropped the card, we don't want it to be draggable anymore. You've made your choice. You've played your hand. Like, you're done. Then we want to say network identity, and we'll just give it a name, lowercase network, or camel case network identity. You can call it whatever you want. Equals network client dot connection dot identity. You'll recall this is how we accessed in the draw card script the player manager in the scene that we're working on. Like if I'm working in client A, I want client A's player manager, not somebody else's player manager. Player manager is equal to network identity dot get component player manager. Don't forget your parentheses here. And then player manager dot play card, and then in parentheses game object, lowercase g, uppercase O. And we haven't written the play card method just yet. We will in just a moment, but this just means that we want to tell the player manager that this client is attached to, or that is attached to this client that is in the local scene. We want to tell it to run a method called play card, and we want to pass in this particular game object, this card, which we do so by just saying game object with a lowercase g. Now, if it's not over the drop zone, just send it back to its start position, which we've saved, and that can all stay the same. And that's pretty much it for our drag drop script. Let's pop over to our player manager and write that play card. Method. We can do that under well, let's do it under this command deal cards. We'll say public void play card, and which will take a game object, uppercase game object because it's a type, game object card, and we'll call another method that we haven't written yet, command play card, and it will take card as well. Okay, then right underneath this, remember to write a command, which is something a client tells the server to do. We need this header, and we also need, we'll call it void command play card. And it takes a game object card. Remember that it needs to start with CMD. And this is just one way of calling a public method from somewhere else, and then we've kind of like obscured our command here as a private method. And we'll call this we'll say that the only job of this command is to use RPC show card, our remote procedure call. And we'll pass in card, and we'll say played as a string. And you'll recall that in the previous episode, we created this private void RPC show card, which takes a game object card and a string type. And we said that if the type is dealt, we want it to send it to the player area or the enemy area based on whether or not it has authority. And we also said, or if it's played, we want to do something else. Well, what is the else that we want to do here? Well, it's pretty actually simple and probably pretty intuitive. We want to say card.transform.setParent to the drop zone that we've referenced at the top of the script, .transform, and comma false. We don't want it to keep its world position. We want to set its world position to the drop zone. And that's it for now, actually. So let's just walk through this one more time. When somebody drags a card and then drops it, when somebody tries to drag a card, if they don't have authority over that card, meaning they didn't request for it to be spawned, they shouldn't be able to do anything with it. But if they do have authority, it should follow the mouse. When they drop it, if it's over the drop zone, they should set it to not be draggable anymore, set the parent of it to the drop zone within their own scene, find the player manager within the scene, and run the play card method and passing in the game object itself, the card itself. When the player manager receives that the call for that method of play card, all it needs to do is run the command, which you'll recall is what a client requests a server to do something, the command play card, and pass in that card. And we basically initiate a chain reaction or a waterfall here. The command then runs the command play card then just runs the remote procedure call, which you recall is what a server requests all clients to do, and it passes in that card and said this card was just played. When we get to our client RPC, which is RPC show card, we see that the card hasn't been dealt, it's been played, and because of that, it should set the parent of the card to the drop zone in the scene. This is a typical process or workflow that you'll probably experience with a lot of the things that you're going to do with your card game. We'll look at a couple of more examples in later videos where we do this, where we call a command from somewhere. The command then initiates a remote procedure call so that we're asking from one client, let's say client A, me, I'm asking the server to do something. The server processes that information, and then it requests all of the clients, including my own, to handle the user interface, to render things on the screen for me appropriately. That's the best way that I found of managing this workflow. Make sure I save this, and I'm going to go back into my scene, let it compile, and I'm going to hit Control B to build the game. And check my email in the meanwhile. And when this game is built, we're going to use the same process as we did before. Oh, let's see. There are a couple of errors. Let's see what errors we found. Failed to prepare target build directory. Is a built game instance running? Let's see. Yeah, I'm still running a game from I think our previous video, so I'm just going to Alt F4 out of this. And then now that I've done that, I can wait again for the game to build. It would be nice if it just checked that beforehand, but what can you do? So wait for this to build again. And as it does that, as I mentioned, we're going to use the same process as we used before. We're going to say that I'm client A and you're client B. And just for funsies, I'm going to hit play. I'll be the host, meaning that I'm a server and client A. You'll just be client B, so I'll click on client here. I'm going to hit draw cards on your side, client B. We notice 4 blue cards, 1 magenta card. I see that on my screen. I do the same. I've got 4 magenta cards, and you've got 1 and 1 blue card. You see that on your scene. Now I'm going to drag and drop one of your cards, or you're going to drag and drop on client B to the drop zone. And it shows up right here in my drop zone, which is really cool. I'm going to do the same here. I'm going to drag a pink card, drop it in the drop zone, and it appears right here. So that's working correctly. I think we can be pretty happy with the functionality there. Hey everybody, future MS Farzan here, and I've returned to the past, or I guess this is the present, to warn you about an issue that you might come across when we start using a tool several videos from now called Dangersync, which allows us to run 2 or more Unity editors in sync side by side with one another so that we don't have to keep building the scene every time. You may have already encountered this if you're using multiple monitors, and I want to give you some ideas about how to work with this, as it may be specific to your use case scenario, however you're building your game. So what I have running here is a built version of the game, which I'm actually going to run as a server. We haven't seen that yet, so don't worry too much about this. Remember, I'm coming at you from the future. So this is going to run as a server, and then these 2 clients or editors are going to run as the client. The left-hand side will be client A. The right-hand side will be client B. And when I draw cards with client A, in future videos, we're going to build it out in a fashion so that client B can't see those cards. And when client B draws cards, well, they show up on client A's screen, but client A can't see them. They just see the backs of them. And now when I drag and drop a card from client A, we see that appear, and one of the cards up here disappears. And when I drag a card from client B, that's shown on client A, and everything just seems like it's working properly, which it very much is. But if I stop these clients, and remember I'm playing these side by side so that I can see everything, and I'm stopping the server. If I play the way that we have been doing and have one client be the host and the other client just be a standalone client. Now, when I draw cards with the host, which is client A, and then do the same with client B, we're going to see some hinkiness that when I pull a card from my hand on client A and move it around, you can't see it on client B. Everything's working fine. Then when I drop it, it populates correctly. But the opposite isn't true when you are using client B and you draw a card or you pull a card from the deck and you drag it around the screen. You notice that it's moving around in client A. Which happens to be the host, and it's not moving naturally. Like what we'd want to see is that when I move this forward on client B, it actually should go lower on the screen with client A to kind of simulate if I were to move my hand in that fashion. And when I drop it, it works fine. We'll take a look at how that works and what are some ways to address that, which will be specific to your use case. I'm just going to stop the game from running. And the issue here is if I go to my card 1 and card 2 prefabs, the way that you probably already have it set up, because we haven't really addressed this in our videos so far, is that if I go down to the network transform of these prefabs, I have an option here to change the sync mode from observers to owner, which I've done in my build here. You haven't done it. You probably haven't done it yet in yours. And when I change the sync mode in card 1 and card 2 from observers to owner, That means that the way that Mirror is going to look for ways to synchronize the transform or wherever the card is on the screen, you're dictating whether you want those changes to be visible to all observers, like everybody in the game, or just the owner of that game object, which in this case would be the client that is moving them around the screen. You can look that up in the synchronization section of the Mirror networking documentation if you'd like to know more about that. But just know that if you're saying sync mode owner, that means that when the card moves around, you only really want the client that is moving around the card, that has ownership over the card, to be able to see that. Or if you have it as observers, that means you want everybody to be able to see that. That's going to depend on your use case, like I said, because there might be a situation, for example, where you have a card game or a board game where you want people to be able to see all of the moves that are happening on the board at the same at the time. Like you want to be able to track that movement while it's happening, and so that's a use case that isn't very like you don't really see that in card games where I just need to know when the card is in the hand or when it's been placed on the board or when it's been shuffled into the discard pile. So if you do need let's review this. Let's review a couple of options here and why this is going weird. It worked in the first case when we had a server running in the background and then we had these two clients, but it doesn't work quite properly when I'm using a host-client relationship where this client on the left is also a server and this client on the right is just a client, because the server generally has ownership over everything in the game. So client A thinks that it has ownership over that card that client B is moving, even though the client doesn't have ownership, the server has ownership. But since client A is also a server, it sees that movement where it shouldn't if it were operating just as a client. There are a couple of ways to deal with this, and I don't really want to dictate how this works for you. So you'll have to think through what this means. The first thing that I would caution is that the way that we're building this game is when cards are dealt by the server, technically both clients actually know what those cards are. At this point in the series, we're developing with the mind that when client A draws cards, they'll populate on client B's rendering here. And then we're gonna flip them over so that they only see the card backs. But technically, in the back end, client B knows what those cards are. And if you're worried about hacking or, which is funny because my games are about hacking, if you're worried about hacking or cheating, that might be a concern. So you might consider in your card drawing script, which in our series will be in the player manager. Rather than actually rendering those cards on screen, you might just render like just the backs of like 5 dummy cards on the client that doesn't need to know them, and only populate or spawn, or I should say, render the cards within a client scene when they're dropped or when they should be seen by that player. That would be one option of how to do things, which I kind of like that for my game, because if anybody's going to be cheating and they know how to figure out what cards have been drawn and just flipped, they might be able to run a script that accesses that information. So it might be good to just within the for loop that deals cards to both clients or renders them, the remote procedure call that does that, instead of actually populating those cards, it might be a good idea to just populate the backs of those cards and as out of dummy cards, so no one's able to access that information. That's one thing to consider. The other thing is that if you have a problem, if you have this problem and you need to render the moves that players are making within updates, so they're always able to see that, you might consider, and I haven't done this myself, so I can't verify, I haven't made it to work myself, but you might have to look into some sort of state synchronization within Mirror that allows you to see the moves of something that happens all at the same at one time. And that would be something you just look into the the mirror documentation or some of the examples to see how they treat movement of objects on the screen. Let's say you can look at the tanks tutorial or the Pong tutorial that are included in this mirror examples folder, or just go online the documentation and take a look at that, because that's not something that I really use for my games. So I'm not as familiar with it. So those are two options. And if you have any issues with the grid layout group that you were using, and let's say that I've had some issues, for example, when dragging and dropping, that when I've dragged a card from the player hand on the other client, the opponent hand starts to do some weirdness because it removes one card, and then if I drop the card, it might replace it. Just, it's obviously not happening here, so I can't really reproduce it for you. But if you have those something like that, you might consider just not using a grid layout group at all for those use cases. There's nothing saying that you can't just render the cards on screen programmatically in sequence, and then go about it that way. So the grid layout group is helpful, but if it gets in your way, it's definitely not essential. Anyway, so Future Som here, just to smooth your way a little bit later, a few videos down the road, and hope that's helpful. Keep going, and don't tell Present Som that I was here. Back to Present Som. What do we still need to sort here? Well, one thing that I see is that it's hard to see the text on these cards, so we need to zoom in somehow and figure out how to be able to see a larger representation of the card. We'll handle that in a later video. The most immediate thing for me is that, at least in my card game, I want to make sure that when I'm dealt cards, I can see them, and then I can see a representation of them on my screen. I'm sorry, I can see them on my screen, and you can see a representation of them on your screen, but not vice versa. I don't want you to be able to see my cards when they're dealt, and I don't want you to be able. I don't want to see your cards. Basically, no one should see each other's cards until they're played. So we need to implement a card flipper that will handle that logic for us. So that's what we'll tackle in our next video. I hope this video has been helpful for you. If it has, please be sure to like it and subscribe to my channel for more. You can also follow me on Twitter and check out my books and games by following the link in the description for this video, or just go to www.nightpathpub.com, and we'll see you soon.